Development of nose and nasal cavities. So you can see the diagram in which the maxillary process, mandibular processes of first arch they are visible, then lens placard and nasal placard. So from our lecture of development of face, we know how the nasal pit is formed, which is communicating with the stomatodium. You can see in this diagram. So this is the developing eye. So nasal pits are cut off from the stomatodium by the fusion of maxillary process with the medial nasal process. So we know this diagram from that lecture. So once the medial and lateral nasal processes they fuse with each other, so these nasal pits are cut off from the stomatodium. Initially they have communication with the stomatodium. Now anterior nares they come close to each other. You can see here because of the narrowing of the frontonasal process. The deeper part of the frontonasal process forms the nasal septum. Now this mesoderm becomes heaped up in the median plane to form the prominence of the nose. Simultaneously a groove appears between the region of nose and the bulging forebrain. As the nose becomes prominent, definitely the shaping of the nose it happens, the anterior nares come to open downward instead of forward. Initially they are facing anteriorly, later on with the development of the nose or with the formation of the shape of the nose, the anterior nares now they face downwards. Coming to the nasal cavities, these are formed by the extension of nasal pits. We know the nasal pits which are communicating with the stomatodium initially. Now for this, primitive palate is derived from frontonasal process that we know. Now these nasal pits now deepen to form the nasal sacs. You can see the deepening of the anterior nares, then nasal pit is happening and they are going to form the nasal sacs, which are separated from the stomatodium by thin membrane known as bucconasal membrane. Now this membrane soon breaks down the ventral orifice that opens on the face, we call it as anterior nares, and once the breaking of the bucconasal membrane it happens, the dorsal orifice that opens into the stomatodium now, which is called as primitive posterior nares. Initially the two nasal sacs are widely separated from one another by frontonasal process. Frontonasal process progressively become narrow. Narrowing of the frontonasal process and widening of the nasal cavities themselves bring them close together, and the intervening tissue become narrow to form the nasal septum. Ventral part of the nasal septum is attached below to the primitive palate, and posteriorly the septum is attached to the bucconasal membrane, but on disappearance of this membrane it has free lower edge. Now this is a further development. The nasal cavities are separated from mouth by palate, it is clear. The lateral wall of the nose is formed from lateral nasal process. Nasal conchae they appear as an elevation on the lateral wall, and olfactory placard forms the olfactory epithelium. So this complete the development of the nasal cavities. Now if we see the word paranasal sinuses, these are basically diverticulum which is arising in relation to the different you can say to the different bone. So these are the diverticulae which are arising from the nasal cavity. They invade the bone, after which they are given the name. The maxillary and the sphenoidal sinuses begin to develop before birth. The other sinuses they develop after birth. Now with this knowledge of the development of the nasal cavity, if arrest is happening at any stage, that can lead to the different anomalies. First is atresia of the cavity, which may be unilateral or bilateral, may be at anterior nares or posterior nares of cavity proper, or rarely they are totally absent. Now the congenital defect in the cribriform plate may lead to the communication with the cranial cavity and the nose. So deviated nasal septum, the septum is deviated to one side, then communication between mouth and nasal cavity can happen. So this is all about the developmental anomalies of the nasal cavity. So this lecture it covers the development of nose and nasal cavities. So